Nic, welcome to Better Than Fine. It's delightful to have you. And I want to start by just saying, so many people who live in this overlap of like something else and well-being. I like to say that we're like the unicorn convention because we never know how to tell when somebody asks what we do. We're like, well, so I guess first, can you just share with us kind of what you're on about? Like, what are you in the unicorn convention?
What am I in the unicorn convention? I'm an alchemist.
You are.
I think of myself an alchemist, jokingly, obviously, about turning lead into gold. But basically, what I try and do is I'm a statistician by trade, and I create measures of people's experience of life, their well-being, their happiness, and but always with the idea that we are trying to help people lead better lives. And so, how do you create statistics that help people reflect on their lives? How do you create statistics that help teams and organizations improve employee experience? That's what I mainly work on now, that I have worked a lot on population well-being too. So that's what I do. So I think of myself as my weapon of choice is statistics about how we try and improve the world.
And I think it's really interesting to then take that leveraged weapon of choice and really, from what I've seen looking at your body of work, make this intention choice to, okay, it's not just about, making more money or making more widgets. It's about like making things more better, which I think is really interesting.
I mean, if I rather grandly look back at my so-called career, which was more of a random walk, I think basically I wasn't quite sure what the purpose of life was when I was young. So I started exploring that, and I explored that with numbers. I also trained as a therapist. So I did that with sort of one-to-one people stuff as well. So it was basically a sort of a long exploration into that. And then, my work became popular, which is kind of nice.
This is kind of nice, right? Okay, a second ago you said that when you were younger you weren't sure what your purpose of life was. Then does that imply that you have a sense of purpose of life now?
Oh, for sure.
Tell me about that.
Well, it's to make the world a better place little by little, and to make my contribution, and to also understand that it's crazy. When I was young, I wanted to change the world. That's kind of crazy. I can do my bit. And actually, you also have to learn to look after yourself, as you, especially when you take on big goals. I took on things like GDP as a bad measure of progress. I mean, that's not going to get easily changed in my lifetime. Climate change has been something I've thought about and worked on a lot. You're an individual in that process. You're not responsible for it all, but you're obviously responsible for what you do with your life. So you take responsibility for what you can do with it, but don't not enjoy yourself as you go along. So that seemed to me a very, very critical thing to do. Yeah.
Oh, you touched on so many rich things in there that I'm swimming a little bit in it, because you touched on like don't not enjoy yourself, but also the take care of yourself part, but also the desire to change the world and do it little by little. And there's so you just hit essentially everything I want to talk to you about all in like three sentences. I'm not sure where to go, because you're broadly interested in human well-being. You mentioned that you've worked on changing the measure from GDP to happiness. You're working now at the micro level of week to week pulse happiness in work. And one of the things that I find really inspirational about your work, and I find it also in myself and in my work with my clients, is you're working at the micro level, like the moment level, the week, the individual, to the group, then to the organization. And then you've also worked at this ultra macro of like nation level, which just to me shows a mind that understands that it is all interconnected and interdisciplinary, and it has this scope level and individual level effect simultaneously. And I don't know that there's a question there, but I really would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I I think that when I started out in my 20s, I was, quite into the idea that Socrates said about know thyself. That, if you want to do something in the world, knowing yourself is a good place to start. And so, I started off in my journey thinking about, thinking about what did I want to contribute in this life, and I did that quite early. And my mother was a family therapist, so in a way that took me into the world of therapy. But then I came out of that thinking, well, actually, although I enjoy the therapeutic process, particularly for myself, more than being a therapist, actually, if I'm strictly honest, then I thought, well, actually, I don't think it's very good to sort of help people be healthy in unhealthy systems. So I'm more systems thinking. So, my statistics comes in there. So I sort of just always been juggling these two bits. And I actually did a great master's course in the 1990s on change at an individual, a group, and an organizational level, and understanding those different levels of change and what emerges at each level, and thinking about how the interventions are different, I think has probably set me up for the kind of work I did. And I went beyond the organizational into the societal in lots of ways by happenstance. I just was doing work and the think tank said, why don't you come do some work with us on well-being? And I went, okay, why not? I'll try that, and then took it to being, within 9-10 years, I got a TED talk out of that because he'd done interesting work. So I don't know. I was sort of aware. I was open to how I worked, I think, somehow. Don't know.
What I'm hearing in there that I think is important to highlight for anybody is this idea of I knew that I wanted to improve things. I knew what I was good at, which is like hearken to me of the positive psychology strengths approach. And then I let the process lead me to good work, which is, I think, solid advice for anyone out living in the world doing anything, right? Like
Yeah,
have positive intention.
yeah, I think so. I've sometimes run a workshop like for students, like what's your strength? What's the big issue that motivates you, and what's your strength so you can contribute? And it doesn't really matter to me if it's, you know, donkeys. It could be donkey sanctuaries. There's value in looking after animals and certainly biodiversity and all sorts of things. But it's like if that's what your passion is. So it could be, um, you know, uh, racial issues, gender issues, it can be climate change, it can be social justice, poverty, whatever it is that really motivates you, particularly in injustice in the world. And then what can I contribute to doing anything about that? I came at it having done economics at university and statistics, so I kind of had a go at the economic system for a while. And then
How was that?
and then eventually you slightly, I mean, you have to watch your energy levels when you're doing issues on big things. So if people are doing stuff on climate change or gender issues or race issues, they're gonna knacker you, they're gonna tire you out because they're big issues. So you do have to think about where's my energy and how I sustain it to go along so that you can continue to lead a happy life yourself. It's not much point being a happiness person if you don't actually happy yourself, in my opinion. And strangely, a lot of them aren't. Strangely, quite a lot of the people in the happiness movement are grumpy old men.
I'm going to back slowly away from the comments I have on that necessarily. Well, but I think you also bring up a relevant point in at least the happiness world. We do find that most of the work is being done right by older men, and or at least I should say the foundational work. And now
Yeah.
I think we're seeing a lot of these newer waves of practitioners and researchers contributing from a broader variety of perspectives. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to see those shifts. But I also think like as a traditionally a fitness person,
Yeah.
right? Like I have a personal training background and then a wellness coaching supplement to it, and now a master's from Penn, from MAP. And coming in as a somatic, like a body person into that world has been fascinating because here's all these people talking about well-being. And I'm like, yeah, but you're completely neglecting the body that all of that well-being is experienced and felt in. Can I get you to go for a walk and take a deep breath, please?
I mean, but that's my challenge too. I take my body for granted far too much. Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? I think there's different personality types of that. I mean, I when I was young, I was very intellectually identified. I was a scholar basically, and went to Cambridge. And so you're very much, you're the brain. It doesn't really matter if you don't do the cross country run. And I've discovered really the only exercise I can do is walking and swimming. Everything else is, yeah, but it's like, and I should be fitter, I should be slimmer, I should be all this stuff. But there again, I also think I'm happy. So
right. But and that's the shoulding, right? Like, oh man, you corrected yourself there. Because I think there's a reframe, not to get all coachy on you, but there's a reframe in there that you throw the should, I should be this, I should be that, but you're happy. If you're healthy, if you like what you're doing, all the motivational research says you're way better focusing on the happiness thing than you are focusing on that other stuff. So what's it matter?
I mean, that is kind of the thing.
Yeah.
And there again, I don't know. I mean, it's a difficult one. I mean, I'm sure I do deep down have some body shame, like quite a lot of people do,
Oh,
actually.
yes.
And I think that's, that's a big issue.
Well,
Yeah.
you circle me back to something you said earlier that I really wanted to come back to. So let's just carry the wave here. You'd said doing the work on being individually healthy, but in an unhealthy system, right? Like
Yeah.
that this is another good example of, at least from my worlds, we created this unhealthy system of shaming people into being a certain weight or eating a certain way, that ultimately, even if they're successful, makes them unhappy because of where their focus is, and then they revert. So you're creating a temporary health in an unhealthy ecosystem, thereby poisoning the well.
Yeah.
um, and it seems like as we talk about this more, I'm seeing more and more ripples of like, oh yeah, and the work thing, and then the home is stressful, and then the body stuff. um so where do you see, and at least in your work and your experience, the approach to solution? Because to me it seems like the solution is individual and systemic at the same time, and I don't necessarily know how to approach helping in any of it. What do you think?
Well, there are different intervention points, aren't there? And I think that's kind of where the levels are interesting. There's always intervention points at the individual level. Even when we're in circumstances of our not of our choosing, there are things that we can do to improve our situation. And we often find ourselves in systems. I mean, when we're children, we don't choose which family we're born into, and we can be blessed, like I was, to be born into pretty functional, certainly loving, and actually wealthy family. And other people are born into extremely difficult circumstances, with abusive parents, or separated, and poverty and all sorts of things. So there's systems that really, really shape us. And within that, there still is something about the human spirit, about how we can do. And we find that people come out of very difficult circumstances to really thrive. We find some people born into very benign circumstances really sink. What's absolutely clear is more people thrive in benign circumstances and more people sink in bad ones. But there's things that go on there. So it's a complex space, and I think sometimes burden the burden of intervention falls too much on the individual. So there are people that go on about happiness at work, which I'm dealing with at the moment, and basically say it's a choice. And I think that's kind of rubbish. I mean, there's some choice in it, but really the system shapes us much more than we realize. And I think the whole of behavioral psychology is showing that. And so and then that's even before you get into food systems and other systems, which shapes. So I become interested about how you work at the system level, but then you get into like, what level of system do you want to work at? Do you want to work at the national? Do you want to work at the sort of, so the macro? Do you want to work at I think some people call it the meso, which is sort of organizational level? Do you want to work at the micro, the individual? And I kind of find myself quite interested in teams. And teams and families are similar in the sense that they're similar sort of sizes. They're sort of 3 to 8 people, and that's very, and our experience of life is very proximal, very, very related to who we spend the most time with and we're closest to emotionally. And I think it's a really interesting intervention point to think of those small groups, and that tends to be where my focus is now.
And in that focus, I know a moment ago you mentioned that oftentimes our circumstances as adults are not fully under our control, but then we have control on how we might manage them or handle them. Um, can you talk a bit about Friday Pulse and what you've seen in the last year? I know we were just talking about it online a second ago, but where you're seeing this team level systems interventions be successful.
Yeah, so Friday Pulse is basically what I'm doing latest, which is it's part measurement and it's part about how we improve team experience. And the idea of choosing the team is that individuals are shaped by the team, and then obviously teams together make up an organization. That's what organizations are made up of. So if you can get the team right, you'll get good flow up to the organization, you get good flow down to the individuals. And so we help teams uh, measure how every week is, and then also do things like say what's gone well, what we're frustrated about. Is there anyone we want to thank? So Barbara Fredrickson talk about positivity resonance. So basically, when you thank and appreciate someone, you feel good for thanking them, they feel good for being thanked. If it's in public, everyone else feels great about it too. So you're trying to create that positivity resonance around positive emotions at a team level. And that helps the individual and it helps the organization because there's just so much evidence that happier teams are more productive, more collaborative, more creative, more innovative. People don't leave. Everything is stacked up. So you're trying to look for that alignment between the levels that we were talking about earlier. And that's what Friday Pulse does. So as I said, measurement is the entry point for our product. I'm a statistician, of course. So we ask people repeatedly, how have you felt this work, from very unhappy to very happy? And then we can plot graphs. So this is an interesting social experiment that's gone on this last year. What do we do during a pandemic? And of course, what happened last March 2020 was everyone was anxious, frightened, having to change the way they worked, and we saw all of our data absolutely bottom out. And then we saw a slow recovery back towards where people were, as people adjusted to new ways of working. We only measure people that are working, we only measure them in our clients, and then we saw it basically flatten off towards the end of the year. And I thought, that's great. Look, that's sort of how everything is for everyone, surely. And then just last weekend, the World Happiness Report came out, and there were graphs in there about the happiness of workers across the whole UK. And for the first half of the year, basically followed the shape of our curve. And then the second half of the year, really interestingly, there's a huge dip in the happiness of workers across the UK dealing with the second wave, and across our clients, they hold steady. And that's very interesting, because that's basically saying that our platform is helping our clients be resilient and actually not, sink into the second wave as much. It doesn't mean to say it wasn't a pressure for them, but they cope with it much better than certainly it looks like the general population. So that's quite heartening, and that's what data can show you. Data can show you stories that sometimes take you by surprise, and I think that's what our tools try and help people leaders in organizations do, is be open to hearing what's really going on for people. You will be surprised. You will find that areas are thriving that you didn't realize, or coping better than you realize, and you'll find some that aren't, and then you can apply your attention to where it's needed.
Yeah, strengths, focus, and adjust.
Yeah.
And also, I would imagine for you personally, just the heartening aspect of like, oh, it is working, and not just working in a way where like, oh yeah, I can see that our people are good, but oh, I can see where our people fared better and were more resilient and learned skills of support and progress. Yeah, how's that feel for you?
Well, you try and create things that are useful. I think that's and I probably created two things before in my career I thought were useful. So Happy Planet Index, and then we did something called 5 Ways to Wellbeing, which was for the UK government,
Mhm.
on things people could do individually. And particularly the second was very pleasant, because it was a tiny project for us, and it just sort of went viral across different sort of public health agencies across the world, and people started using it because it was useful. And this is more intentional. I've tried to build this, and it's taken quite a long time to get to the Friday platform. But yeah, so it's been sort of working in real for about 2 years now. We've been working with it, and that's in a way the most pleasing data. I mean, I've still got to just work out statistically quite what I think about it, but basically I think we've protected our clients from having a second dip, and that is worth a lot to them. And yeah.
That's great. No, I love learning. I love learning that. I love hearing about it. Um, I saw your speech you gave last week,
Yeah.
the impulse for my outreach. And in that speech, you talked about something that surprised me a bit. Well, I guess now in hindsight, I say it doesn't surprise me, because I guess I watched it real time in my clients. But at the time, we'd made this assumption as people went remote, as lockdown started, that work-life balance was going to get better, right? Because we're not commuting and we're with our families more. But that the data is showing that it got worse, right? People are feeling less balanced. Can you speak to that at all? And like, what do you think that's about? And is there any way that you are addressing that at Friday Pulse, or that you might like, what's your thinking around it?
Yeah, so it took me by surprise, that data. So when I started looking at it, because we measure this weekly experience, but we also every quarter with our clients measure what we call a culture profile, which is 15 questions, and included in those work-life balance. And the idea is these are the drivers of people's happiness at work. And I just, I don't have so much time at the moment for doing the data analysis on the data we have. We basically present it back to our clients to empower them to do stuff with it. But, I have been collecting the data into one global data set because of COVID, really. And when I looked at it first, I thought, God, that's a surprise. So team relationships and friendships at work were under pressure, so going down. That didn't surprise me. And creativity and influencing decisions went up, I guess, because people have had to like adjust and it's been in a sense more put down to the individual to do their own work. So in the way that makes sense too. but work-life balance was the biggest faller. And I had thought, well, you get rid of the commute to work. So I know from other data that work is the second least activity in people's regular daily lives, and the commute to and from work is the least happy. In fact, strictly speaking, the commute to work is the least happy, then the commute back from work, and then work. So those are the very regular activities. There are other things that can happen to people that are less happy, but the regular things that you go. So, okay, there you go. So I thought, well, get rid of the commute. People are going to be a bit happier. And it's actually very varied. And I think one of the things is that people are working longer hours. So there's data coming out across the economy that people are finding it difficult to know when work stops and home starts. I mean, for the first lockdown, I was working from my bedroom because we had two teens in the house who were working, my wife, and so I just made a corner of the bedroom, which meant I woke up and there's my desk, and I go to sleep and there's my desk. We did start to get a thing where I put a blanket over my desk and my computer at night. But it becomes less easy to know where you stop and where you start, and I think that's what people are struggling from. I'm actually, well, I got very stressed actually last summer. Last July, I mean, this will make you laugh, but I sort of was just exhausted, and I sort of became tearful on the sofa, and my wife looked at me and goes, Nick, I'm like that every day, every week. You just, but but it's just the stress just started to just get to you, and I started to just, and actually, what I did in the end, after talking a lot of my team, we've gone to a 4-day-a-week company, and we all decided that we would do that. I mean, I'm now pretty much working 5 days again, but I guess come the summer I'll probably go back to 4 days. But we really decided we needed to look after our work-life balance a lot, and so that was something to do, that we could, like, let's work 4 days and then you can do other stuff. And people have kids at home, so they need to spend more time in those. Some of my team, one of mine started volunteering at a food bank on her day off, and people do nice things with it, and actually it's actually good for the whole health of the company.
Wonderful. I want to thank you because I personally try to make a point of, as a practitioner, both in fitness and someone who talks about positive psychology in public, I try to recognize my own human experience, because I think there are too many people out there projecting perfection when they're actually struggling and very human. And so thank you for being a person that recognized that, like, hey, that was hard for me too. Because I always want to make sure I don't look like the shiny penny who, if you flip it over, it's all tarnish. Because we're all in a human experience, right? We're all still figuring out how to apply all of these same interventions in our own lives. And, my meditation practice has fallen off in the winter, and, whatever. And also the further reflection on applying it to your own team once you learned the information. Because to me, all of that speaks to, like, your integrity as an entrepreneur, as a practitioner, as a person. And that's just awesome to hear about.
I mean, I definitely think if something, I mean, I think that if I'm experiencing something, other people are too. I mean, that's sort of, but yeah, I mean, it's how you, I think treating people that work with you as human beings and understanding that they've got their stresses. Like, several of my team with young children just suddenly said, okay, I can work from 11 till 3, and then I have to do this and that, and I'll catch up in the evenings, and it's, fine.
Yeah.
Fine. It's like, we know we have responsibility to clients when we speak to them. We know we have to get our work done. We're adults, we so what's the problem? I mean, it doesn't mean to say you don't have to give feedback to people about the quality of their work, but I don't think you should be prescriptive in how they work too much.
Well, this brings up something else that I had intended to talk about more, about the Happy Planet Index, let's just start with, can you explain what the Happy Planet Index is? And I know that's not your primary work right now, but I still think it's cool work.
No, I mean, actually, we just starting to have meetings about doing one, doing another Happy Planet Index. So Happy Planet Index is, I spent, my first publication was 1994, which was called the Index for Sustainable Economic Welfare. And it was a hugely complicated indicator. And it had 26 interlocking spreadsheets, and basically we plotted what was sustainable well-being in the UK and how it changed over time. Okay, and actually welfare, and it was great fun to do. Spent a lot of time in the basement of LSE Library digging out statistics and stuff.
I'm sure it was very fun for you.
Yeah, it's very nerdy, very fun. All right, and
it was awesome.
hugely complicated, and it used a nice trend line, and basically I knew it was wrong because there were just too many assumptions in it, but it made some impact in some ways. Anyway, when I was at New Economics Foundation, which is the think tank I worked at for more than a decade, I was asked, well, can you come up with something on, more on sustainability? And I came up with the idea of the Happy Planet Index, which is basically to say that the aim of nations is to create good lives, and they don't have to cost the earth. So the way that you do that is that you plot quality of people's lives against their ecological footprint, and you create a sort of a graph with the nations scattered. So basically what it identifies is that there are countries which are richer and relatively happy if we look across the globe, so the World Happiness Report was out last week, and Scandinavian countries do well, and so we know they're at the top of that, but they're using a lot of planetary resources to get there. And then there are other nations which are really doing very poorly on well-being, but they're not using many resources. So things like sub-Saharan Africa, where people, still leading short, unhappy lives. And then in the middle, you've got a sweet spot, which is you've got countries, say Latin America, some Asian countries, which have got relatively contained levels of ecological footprint, they're probably too high, and relatively good levels of well-being. And so there's a trade-off between these. And so Costa Rica came out top of it. And actually the first time I showed you a graph just before this, which is very rough and ready. The first time I did a rough and ready calculation on Happy Planet Index, I saw that Latin America was going to do well. And I thought, that is interesting, because my experience of Latin America is very vibrant, very community-led. And yes, of course, there's deep problems in Latin America with violence, and it's troublesome export trade to North America, which could be called, the war against drugs. But hey, who's consuming them? And and other issues, including entrenched misogyny in all sorts of places. But they do have a joie de vivre, and they that whatever the Pura Vida, I think is what they call it, in and they very, very community led, very family led, and people are generally happy. So I thought it was interesting. And so Happy Planet is a challenge to saying, where are we going globally? And basically the thing is, I'm absolutely convinced we have to create good lives that don't cost the earth. I do think that people are becoming more and more aware of it. Trump was a last bleep of something. I couldn't really do. I think, what's Biden come straight in, so climate's top of the agenda. Even Boris Johnson in my country talks about climate a lot. I think we do understand this is a huge issue to face them, and we've got to plot our way. I mean, climate change is really the unintentional consequences of how we go about our daily lives. No one is planning to destroy the climate. Even the people that are in denial, they really just want to protect their way of life. I think so it's a very, very difficult issue. And the Happy Planet was just to go say, look, hey, the aim surely is to create good lives, and we just need to find a new way of doing it, and that shouldn't be beyond us. I hope it isn't.
Thank you. Excellent explanation. And I agree with, I don't know that there was a thing in there that I don't agree with. So I'm behind the project, I'm behind the whole thing, and excited by it, because you do a good job of articulating many thoughts that I've had that I have felt personally powerless to influence. But I want to tie it back to the conversation we were having on work, where you were like, this isn't complicated. We're trying to create good work, create good lives. We're adults. We'll get it done, respond to what people need. That's how we prevent burnout. And then you just now, the comments on the point of government is to create good lives for their citizenry. I think where I feel the friction, not in myself, but in my desire to help us all find a meaningful, positive life, is in not everyone agrees that that's the point. And where in your efforts to get governments to subscribe to this reframe, which is such you talk about like big goals and big work, like, yes, let me get the world's governments to care about happiness. What in your experience has been the friction?
Well, I mean, the idea of governance should be about creating good lives. I mean, the issue is that our political systems tend to create governments that their main purpose is to get re-elected rather than necessarily to do the most good. So we get into short-termism, and you've no doubt heard of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. In policy, we talk about NIMTO, not in my term of office, and trying to sort of delay things into other people's, because you don't want to deal with them because they're difficult. So climate change often comes into that. Persistent poverty does. until they start biting people, people don't do enough. That's not enough feedback. It's not really feedback rich enough governance. Basically we elect a government, they have 4 or 5 years to do something, and then we re-elect them. Yeah, it's not very, if you think at work, where we tend to have one-to-ones once a month, once a week, whatever you do, we're not really getting that with our government. So I think there's a real problem with our democratic system about not getting enough feedback about what's going on. But that's a beyond thing. But as in, surely the purpose of life should be for people to live a good life, and then they become in and out groups, issues that is it just for me and my family, is it just for me and people that seem like me, is it just for and then we get into tensions, and in a way are those just built into us? I mean, we are a species that has become over successful. There are masses of us, and we try and be one globe, which is a beautiful idea, but clearly in our evolutionary past we were small kinships and tribes, and we fought to protect our own. So there's something very instinctual in us about doing that, and it's like, how do we work with those tensions? And I think that governance should really sit above that and help us respect the fact that people have identities, which can be gender identities, racial identities, where we come from. Like, there's always evidence that if someone has the same accent of you, you trust them much more. They have a different accent. This is just unconscious behavior. Look more like us, we trust them more. So there's things that's very hard for us to move across. Like, say, with diet, sugar's very attracted to us because it was rare. So there's things that don't necessarily help us function brilliantly, that we've got instincts about, and I think that's how we manage those is a challenge.
I'm tempted to go down the rabbit hole of the way that those instincts then get exploited in a capitalistic system, because I don't think it's just democracy, right? Like, sugar is
Yeah.
a perfect example.
Yeah.
The supernormal stimulus of concentrated sweet was rare in a natural environment, and so you ate it because it would help you survive winter. Now it is hidden in food in order to manipulate us into overconsuming without getting proper nutrients so that we want more. And I think we see some of that same, if we want to talk about bias, we see that exploited in media across the, politically identified spectrum. And trying to find any news information that isn't laden with that, just to get you coming back to it. I mean, it's one thing that I saw affecting well-being in my clients throughout the last year has been the pull to have to check the news as soon as they woke up, because they were so tied into the fear. And if I could get them to break that habit and just wait a few hours to check the news, their day was remarkably better.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it, our addiction to news? And I mean, actually, it's what Trump played on brilliantly. I mean, I subscribed to the New York Times just so I could get my fix of what the hell's he done today. And it's like I've actually unsubscribed now because it's nice and dull.
Hooray for dull news. I do check every day to get the numbers, but I also am going to throw out that we try to avoid too much name drop politics, just in case. I would never want to alienate someone who would otherwise benefit from the information. But I am with you in what you're getting at, right? Like, but I guess my point is that it's not just the democratic institution, it's the democratic institution held up by a capitalist system that is benefited by not focusing on happiness.
I think if one examines the capitalist system, there is much to critique it.
Yeah.
And I did spend my more radical youth doing that more, and I think now I've got to the age where possibly I'll leave that to younger, more radical people. I don't know. But I don't know, because it's, in some ways I think of, if I'm very honest, I think of happiness as like a Trojan horse, because if we really took it seriously, we would unravel certain things. And I think the thing for me is that, like, how do we change the narrative that we're thinking about people's experience of life, their well-being, their happiness, away from their status, and I think, it's actually an interesting thing that's we'll see play out over the next 5-10 years. I think, how much are people changed by COVID? I mean, I don't think anyone's going to come out unchanged. Not necessarily, this has been a global trauma, and we see, after individual trauma, we see, post-traumatic stress, or we see post-traumatic growth. There are possibilities in there. And so we've all had to examine what's important to us. We've all learned things about ourselves, and we've adjusted to some things, and others we're missing greatly. So, it's like, but what have mostly people missed? Touch, seeing other people, these very, very human connections, have been what people, I think, are most thirsty and hungry for. And
Yes.
I don't think for many people it's going down the high street and buying clothes that they've really, I mean, they've missed it to an extent, but I just think we will help people re-examine their priorities. And so will that help us slightly dematerialize? Well, I would hope, but I don't know. Humans are unpredictable creatures.
Hmm. I'm with you though in seeing the moment of great opportunity in it, right? For
Mm,
the number of people that can be turned to resilience and connection and meaning and purpose. I think part of it is for those of us in a position to do that is also turning around and helping the people who are in the stress of the trauma, and how do we help guide them out of it not just a society, as a species.
yeah,
um, and if we leave them behind to languish, we're no better than any other moment of trauma and
yeah,
impact. And I want to believe that we're starting to hit that critical mass. I'm an optimist that way.
yeah. No, I'm an optimist too. It
Good.
certainly makes life more fun.
Way more fun. I have a few. I hope they're little questions. Maybe they're
Yeah.
big questions, but as we're wrapping toward the end here, I really want to know what it was like meeting with and working with His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Oh well, I didn't work with him. That's I've met him twice, but and for short conversations, I haven't been in a working group with him or something like that. I've worked with Bhutan a lot on gross national happiness, so I went out to Bhutan 4 or 5 times and spent some sabbatical time there, basically, and I really enjoyed that. And at a personal level, and I mean, actually, they didn't really take my ideas in the sense that I don't actually like gross national happiness as a measure. Too complicated, too difficult, and so but I like it as a spirit. But then
Mm-hmm.
also Bhutan is not as perfect as people think it is. It's deeply hierarchical, and they have a small problem in the south with a bit of sort of ethnic cleansing, which is which they really don't like to talk about. And if you ask them questions about it, they get very defensive. So but having said that, if you look at where it sits geopolitically, it does very well, because it's got China to the north, separatist states of India to the south, Nepal, so I think Bhutan does a pretty good job, but it is yeah, it's a very interesting place.
Yeah, I wish we had time and can unpack the measuring happiness on the national level, and where do we see that with Bhutan. I've wanted to reach out to Alejandro Adler and have him on at some point. I just know he's very busy right now, kind of working on some of the COVID happiness measures in New York and contributing
Yeah,
to the city. So I've been waiting, biding
yeah.
my time for that ask, but it's in the queue. Um, so I've been reading up on you, trying to come up with my own good questions. I came across Manfred Max Neef. Did I say it
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I'm impressed.
He was one of your mentors and
Yeah.
asked you. Most people don't ask big questions, and of course, immediately I got anxious that my questions weren't going to be big enough. But what is the big question that you're asking right now?
So Manfred is one of my mentors, and basically he said he thinks that people spend a lot of time on issues of what he called secondary importance.
Yeah.
And actually, so I think that basically my whole life has been thinking about what's the big question, which is how do we uh, change the narrative of life and actually create a language which is more coherent with people's experience. And so Manfred in that way fundamentally influenced the work I do. Specifically and tactically, I'm working on tactics really at the moment in a way, which is like, how do you operationalize that? Because when I'd done a decade of work with Neff, and I'd done my TED talk, and TED talks is obviously a big peak experience in your career, right? And then after about a year, you work out, well, okay, I can become a professional speaker and I can earn very good money. It's like a speech doesn't change anything really. And so I then thought, well, okay, actually, I'd like to use it as something. How can I create something useful? So Friday Pulse is designed to get into people's weekly experience. We spend a lot of time at work, so it's a really valid way of reaching adults. And if I can get people to reflect on their happiness at work, I presume they're going to reflect on their happiness in life outside of it. So create something that is useful, and that continues to be my purpose at the moment, and probably will wrap me up for another decade. Yeah.
Yeah, I love your focus on creating something useful.
Mm,
I think there's so many people who produce ideas because they want to have an idea to produce, as opposed to producing something that's going to have a meaningful impact in application. And I'm such a hardcore applications person that
mm,
I relate to that on a deep level. Clearly not as a statistician, as a person who's with people, but
yeah,
the need to have it actually be effective and to be able to see the impact of that for you in the numbers, for me in someone's like body,
yeah.
is very core to me, and I get that. Um, and then my last one, I think we're going to wrap it up with this one, is you'd mentioned you had your moment last summer where your wife found you like tearing up on the couch, and she confessed. And full confession for myself, I think there was a period last summer with everything going on in New York City and being in Brooklyn myself, and
Yeah.
I'd moved, I'd had COVID, I'd had the flu, and had like last year was, and I was finishing my master's all at the same time. I think I cried every day for like a month. But what did you change to maintain or enhance your well-being when you had that moment of like, okay, I'm stressed? Like personally, I hear what you mentioned on your team, but what else did you gear shift for yourself?
Um, I mean, I have a tendency to take on too much responsibility, in the sense of like, taking on all my team's issues, my kids, my sisters, my mother, whatever. So it's a bit about creating boundaries for myself, and taking more time out. And we've moved since then, but we did have uh, my wife is delightfully crazy in that she had a hot tub. I moved in with her about 5 years ago. We're only relatively recent, and so I just decided I was going to go in the hot tub every day, and
Nice.
and just work out how I was chilling. I think I wasn't switching off enough, and walking is very good for me for that. I love walking, and last summer was a really good summer, so doing lots of long walks and on my own. It's like I like walking with Zoe, but I also like walking on my own because that's reflection. That's my meditation. I'm not very good at sitting and meditating. Walking meditation is kind of what I do, how I empty my mind and think about things. So I did more walking, and actually, to be honest, this winter I've been a little less good at that, and I'm beginning to feel that that's something I need to do more again as spring comes.
Good. The
Yeah.
trainer in me is all about that.
Mm.
But also, like the somatic embodied person in me is very aware that almost everything you said was something to do with your physical self, unwinding your physical self, anchoring
Yeah.
in your physical self. And I just want to highlight that so that anyone listening, it's like, hey, if you're not making the space, not just to shut off your mind, but to soothe or connect to what's going on in your embodied experience, maybe try that for
Yeah,
them.
I mean, I think burnout is when we lose connection to our bodies in lots of ways. We're pushing us, and we ignoring the signals. And we might power through them with caffeine, alcohol, other stimulants, whatever. To sort of, and in the end, it catches up. It catches up, and so you're better off listening earlier. I didn't burn out last summer, but I was on the way towards it. And I think, I'm sure you and most of your listeners would have had a burnout experience or close one in their life. And it's, it's trying to catch the signals before something, quite traumatic happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we'll leave it there for sake of everyone's time and sanity. But Nic, thank you so much for your time and your generosity with your expertise, and you're clearly very smart brain. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
That's all right. And if people want to just think about their own happiness at work, they can just go to this website called friday1.com, which is something we devised, and it's like a little 5-minute test that you can look at your own happiness at work and compare yourself to other people. It's not dynamic like the ones I was talking about. It's a static fix, but it's helpful for people to reflect. So
Yeah. And
great.
is there anywhere else we can check out your work? I think you have your own website.
Yeah, I have my own website, which is nicmarks.org, but that's more for my speaking, which I'm rather letting go at the moment. And then fridaypulse.com is the whole organization. But Friday One takes you into that universe.
For the
So yeah,
individual. Great.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really nice to chat.